Reduce? So far, at least, we've witnessed exponential growth in plastic use instead of reduction. There are no signs the curve is bending away from exponential growth. Business as usual. It's accelerating. Reuse? The way that plastics are designed and manufactured makes meaningful, scalable reuse almost impossible. Recycle? It's a joke. A tiny percentage of plastic is recycled, even as production is ramping up exponentially. It's a feel-good exercise that allows us to think we are contributing something, but in reality, we are deflecting attention from meaningful solutions. Frankly, oops. Yeah, that's okay. I've got control. Don't worry. Frankly, these slogans were reduce, reuse, recycle were promoted by the plastics industry for decades to avoid their responsibility to this glowing global crisis. So what's the future going to be? Will the plastics industry be our friend or our foe as we try to avoid the consequences of an age of human and plastic? Some call it the Anthropocene. I call it the Plasticine. Or more simply, the obscene. So I'm going to tell a short story that puts this all in context, I think. This is my granddaughter. My new granddaughter, Sierra Rose, as in the mountain range. Sierra was born just 6 months ago. She was born prematurely, 8 weeks early, weighing 2.5 pounds. My daughter, Shori, who's over there, was rushed to the hospital in the middle of the night because she developed preeclampsia. That's a life-threatening condition for mother and baby that usually forces an immediate cesarean. As Sierra grows and learns about that traumatic experience, she might be tempted to shout, "Thank you, plastics." Her survival was only possible because of the plastics in the NICU. When I think about plastics from this perspective, I have to admit, I am thankful for what it brings to us. But there's another side to this story. This is Paradise, California. In November 2018, 88 dead. Everything burned. Everything with all its plastic burned. Volatilized gases of burned plastic were swept towards the Bay Area. There's Paradise up there. There's the plume of smoke headed straight to the Bay Area, where she was pregnant in her 20th week. What happens? Oh, this is the smoke as it hits San Francisco. Do you know what happens when pregnant women are exposed to chemicals that get into smoke like this, or exposed to the chemicals that get into that smoke? It's a risk factor for preeclampsia. It's entirely plausible, but not scientifically certain, that the same plastics that created the life-saving materials in the hospital could be the actual cause of Sierra's birth, premature birth. Which leads to a question I want to explore with you now. Is the future of the plastics industry, what is it going to be? Are they going to be our friend in solving this problem or our foe? Before I dive into the depths of this narrative, I want to ask for a show of hands. How many of you think that one day the plastics industry could be our friend? How many think they are our implacable foe? Randy, you were right. Oh, I should have hit that. But anyway, so this is our question. Plastics, friend or foe? I'm sure everyone thinks of plastics as part of their healthy diet. You want some carbs, some protein, and you can't do without your plastic. Can you believe they were actually running advertisements like this within the last decade? Now that we know people are ingesting microplastics, which can actually be found in our stools, this is crazy. Just today, a new scientific paper was published estimating that we consume the weight equivalent of a credit card's worth of microplastic every week in this country. Every week. That's out today. It'll be into the plasticine next Monday. But as Jane mentioned in her comments last night, food packaging does play a key role in food safety. How do we balance that? What are we going to do? So, better living through chemistry is, we have to appreciate some of the value that that's brought us. I was almost as clueless as everyone else. I still remember making lab equipment, sawing plexiglass with a table saw in the 1970s, not realizing the smell was volatilized BPA heated by that table saw. As late as 1986, Shori, Sierra's mom, was playing in her bathtub at the age of 3 with a rubber ducky laden with phthalates. That was before we knew what was happening. And into the very early 1990s, my favorite winter drink was heated Campbell's condensed chicken broth, taken from a can lined with BPA. But that started to change when I met Theo Colborn in 1988 and Fred Vomsal in 1991. And it went ballistic when I met Jane. And she began to teach me some of the dark secrets of not just plastic food packaging, but also the myriad of toxicological challenges represented by all types of food packaging. That's the faux part, living the plastic nightmare. So, how do we give those chemicals such a free pass for so long? That was because toxicology, appropriately, worried about high doses, not low doses, many of which we didn't know about them because we couldn't even measure them. Plastic was this seemingly inert material that could do miracles. In 1976, Congress passed the Toxic Substance Control Act to protect us from toxic chemicals. The public sighed a deep sigh of relief. One less problem they don't have to worry about. It's all taken care of. These things gave us a false sense of security about threats from chemical exposures. At the time, nobody really knew about low doses. I work on endocrine disrupting compounds. They hack hormone signaling. They can do many different things to many organisms, including people, serious things. We learned a lot about last night thanks to Linda, and we're going to have a whole series of presentations on this today with much more detail. That said, hormones have very powerful effects at tiny amounts, parts per trillion. And endocrine disrupting compounds have effects at parts per billion, parts per trillion. Sometimes they are just as powerful as our native hormones. We have let plastics into every nook and cranny of our lives when we didn't have a clue about this. Industry grew. It became worth billions of dollars. And as the science grew stronger, slowly, there was way too much money at stake for industry to give up. So you all know this chart. Recycling. Here are the categories, 1 through 7, based on the monomers of which each of these categories are made. With that information, we thought we knew what choices were safe to recycle. Rock stars sang songs about recycling. Plastic trash was solved. Except it's not just the monomer that contributes to plastic toxicity. There are additives. We all know about phthalates. There are lots of additives to plastics, and there are different additives in lots of different batches of plastics being made, even though it's the same basic monomer. They're what have been briefly mentioned, non-intentionally added substances. These are reaction byproducts of what you do, which occur when you make plastic. Some of them we know about, some we know are quite toxic. Most of them we don't know about. We don't know what they are, but they're in the plastic nonetheless. Every piece of plastic has known and unknown substances in it. But the way plastic is produced guarantees that each batch of plastic manufactured is different in its toxicity profile. Maybe not different by much, or maybe different by a lot. Not every piece of plastic has toxicity challenges, but you can't just look at the recycling number and know what the problem is going to be. Some of the known ones are really serious, and the unknown ones, how would we know? Are you sure you want to build a recycling system around problems like that? Lastly, there's adsorption and absorption. As plastic exists in the environment, in the oceans, for example, things adhere to its surface or are absorbed into it. Things like DDT, PCBs, dioxins, making them, even benign plastics, toxic. So the problem is worse than you think if you don't know about the additional sources of toxicity. This is Fred von Saal. He's a pilot and a famous endocrine disruption scientist. In 1994, he showed me a graph that utterly destroyed my faith in regulatory testing. Here it is. It's a graph plotting diethylstilbestrol dose along the bottom, increasing to the right, and prostate weight in mice that had been exposed in the womb to DES. What it says is that prostate weight is decreased by a high dose of DES. Okay? Working down the dose response curve, you see that the next dose down, 20 nanograms per gram, there's no difference between it and the control. Okay? So regulatory testing stops at that point. They don't do any more testing. They use safety factors to extrapolate down to what they call the safe dose, which is typically about 1,000-fold beneath the first dose that doesn't have an effect, beneath the first dose that doesn't show an effect, in this case 20 nanograms per gram. They don't test between that no observed adverse effect level and what they call the reference or safe dose. Well, Fred did. And he found that low doses of DES increase prostate weight. That would never have been detected by a standard regulatory test any ever conducted in the world. That was an epiphany for me. Here's a practical, very visual demonstration of this. Linda knows this slide. It's by Retha Newbold, who works at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. It's an example, control mouse, the thin one, fat mouse, the experimental animal. Same strain of mice, same caloric intake, same activity levels. What's different? Well, the experimental mouse, when exposed, was exposed to 1 part per billion of a potent endocrine disrupting compound, diethylstilbestrol, right at birth. It became morbidly obese at about my age in mouse years. Well, I'll go into the science behind this in a couple sessions from now. But here's the important thing for regulatory science. What would happen if that animal had been exposed instead of 1 part per billion to 1,000 parts per billion? It would have been like that scene out of Monty Python where the guy's eating and he puts a wafer in his mouth and it explodes. Remember that scene? Some of you will. Well, no, actually, if that animal had been exposed to 1,000 parts per billion instead of 1, it would have been thinner. It would have lost weight compared to the control. And just as that graph I showed you from Fred von Saal, this would never have been revealed by regulatory testing because they would reduce the exposure from 1,000 parts per billion, lower and lower, until they saw no difference with the control. And they say, okay, fine, let's use their safety factors, and we're done. So I began to have some real questions about this. Are low doses really low? And what is a part per billion anyway? There are lots of different ways to portray that. I love EWG's portrayal. 1 part per billion is one pancake in a stack of pancakes about 4,000 miles high. Sounds like a tiny amount, right? But let me ask the question a different way. If you have a drop of water, and in it there's bisphenol A at 1 part per billion, how many molecules of bisphenol A do you think are in that drop of water? Avogadro's number. 2.65 trillion molecules of bisphenol A are in that drop of water. There are 1 billion times more molecules of water, but that's a lot of molecules to cause problems. So this led to some really painful realizations. We all know most chemicals haven't been tested, especially for endocrine disruption. The tests that are used are by and large flawed and outdated. Some key core assumptions are wrong. And all too often, analyses are manipulated to hide problems. This is Paracelsus. He was the guy who came up with what's now paraphrased as the dose makes the poison, which is what gives regulatory toxicology the excuse to only test at high doses until you don't see a difference. This is Jane. Jane and I visited Paracelsus' birthplace, southeast of Zurich, so she could stick her finger up his nose. She did a really good job. So 2 assumptions of regulatory science really trouble me. The first one is this Paracelsus problem. Stuff happens at low doses that you can't predict with high-dose experiments, yet all regulatory testing is based upon that assumption. If the FDA were to reanalyze their own BPA safety data using this 21st century science and accept its implications, the safe dose of BPA has been calculated by Lara Vandenberg, Gail Prince, and Pat Hunt. It would have to be reduced by a factor of 20,000. I already had that figure up there. 20,000. That's an existential threat to the BPA industry. That's why they don't want to do it. So the second assumption is the following, and you can understand it very simply. What is the first question your physician asks before he gives you a new prescription, or she? What's the first thing? What else are you taking? Because chemicals interact in our body. What question does regulatory toxicology never ask, never answer? How do chemicals in our bodies interact? It's just not done. There's a lot of science trying to figure out how to do that, but all regulatory testing, all regulatory standards to date have been established on a single chemical by chemical analysis. So here's what's happened with global plastic production. Millions of tons a year. We're at about somewhere between 300 and 400 million tons a year. The curve is bending upwards. Where's it going to go? Is the exponential curve going to increase? Or are we going to be able to bend the curve? That's the crucial question. Well, right now, industry's projections are this. It's going to increase fivefold, almost fivefold, between now and 2050. We lose if that happens. Even at the current rate of production, we're seeing problems. Recycling can't manage it, even now. This, especially with Southeast Asia rejecting our trash. What happens when plastic production increases by a factor of 5 by 2050? What happens as they pump out 5 times the current amount? Will we be consuming 5 credit cards worth of microplastics a week? That doesn't sound like a good idea. We published Our Stolen Future in 1996. There was a lot we didn't know then, and we wrote about it completely honestly. But we felt there was enough known to spark a public debate about endocrine disruption. The stakes were too high to wait. Our fertility, our cognitive abilities, and even our survival as a species might be at stake. We wanted to stimulate research investments in resolving the concerns that we raised, not because we wanted to be alarmist, but because we wanted to find out what had real legs. And I am entirely, eternally grateful to institutions like the NIEHS that put really serious money into answering these questions. We didn't know whether the iron grip that industry had on the regulatory authorities and the power of their money to influence public opinion would allow a meaningful response, no matter what the science said. But something happened to me on a dark and stormy night in Camden, New Jersey, that indicated things might not be so bleak. Bad enough, but not bleak. And maybe it would become part of the way we could bend the curve in the direction we wanted to bend it. What happened? This was in 1997. I was from Baltimore. I knew that Camden was where they use cement overshoes, that they don't like you. And I was lecturing that night to the Society of Plastics Engineers. I accepted invitations from people who didn't like me to help me understand where they were coming from and them understand where I was coming from. And it was a contentious meeting. It was done. I survived. Everyone left except two big guys in the back of the room. And they started to walk toward me. And I was physically afraid. They walk up and they say, "Dr. Myers, we like what you're doing." And I said, "What?" And they said, "No, we like what you're doing. You're making certain commodities, plastics, unsellable in the market, and we've got the replacements, and we're going to make a lot of money." And I'm from Reed College in Berkeley. Using the market in a positive way was not something that I had ever thought about. But over time, I began to work with chemists to try and help them make money by designing safer materials. We know so much more about what causes a chemical to be an endocrine disruptor now. We know how to test for it, not perfectly, but so much more than we knew 20, 30 years ago. We can do a much better job helping them help us move to a new generation of inherently safer materials. That's what we have to do. Where are we headed? Remember the 3 R's? It's time for us to acknowledge, as Jane has stated, that recycling is the fig leaf of consumerism. It has failed. Recycling doesn't scratch the surface of the problem, and with all the complexities of plastic toxicity, we cannot pretend that it will be easy to plug plastic into it, even to plug it into a circular economy. The odds against us bending that curve are staggering, but they're not impossible. I see at least 3 essential components of moving forward. Redesign. Let's use modern scientific understanding of endocrine disruption and related toxicities to redesign chemicals so they don't represent hazards, and we can move to a whole new generation of materials. Reform. We can use 21st century science to reform the regulatory system, to get them to be asking the right questions and giving us real answers to what's safe and what's not. Third, we need to use this modern science and our ability to communicate it and share it to recharge and invigorate public concern. That will provide political support for necessary changes in regulatory structure. Just as important, it will help fuel consumer demand for inherently safer materials. We've already done a lot on that front. You go into most retail stores in the country, and you can see the indications that we have changed the consumer world's interest in getting safer products. That will be we continue on that and do it well, that will be a huge incentive for chemists trying to do the right thing, earn more money with safer products. Look at how many of you know what just happened in Europe when the parliament dissolved? Just before the parliament dissolved, it passed a resolution instructing the European Council to stop twiddling their thumbs about endocrine disrupting chemicals, get their act together to manage it using 21st century science. That resolution passed 447 to 14. It was astounding. And I know there are people in this room who helped make that happen. Then the Green parties did much better than people expected. So it makes it more likely that the European Council will not be able to ignore that vote. We don't know exactly how it's going to turn out, and we know we have a lot of work to do because industry's just as aware as we are of what happened. But I think things are moving in the right direction there. This won't happen in the U.S. in the next 2 years. Sorry. But we can move powerfully in the right direction once this episode of political insanity is behind us. So this is Sierra Rose again, and Shori. She's now weighing 11 pounds. She's now not out of the woods yet, but things are looking much better. So when I started this, I asked you to raise your hands. What is it, friend? Any possibility? Can we become friends with these people? And the foes? Are we implacably their opponents? Okay. If they will accept the new R's, use science to redesign and make chemicals less hazardous, and bring regulatory toxicology into the 21st century, and are willing to work with communities to support those efforts, I think we can be their friends. But those have to be what we demand. That's the floor. We demand this. Then we'll work with you. As we have seen from the recent financial consequences suffered because of chemical misbehavior by DuPont, Johnson & Johnson, Monsanto Bayer, and others, it is in their own self-interest to come clean. And there are going to be a lot more stories like that. 21st century science is an existential threat to their business model. The sooner they acknowledge that, accept it, and begin to work with it, the better they will serve their shareholders and all of us, citizens on this one planet that we know for certain supports life. All of us here fear that the plastics industry will continue to ignore the unintended consequences of their innovations over and over and over again. The odds against us reversing their errors are daunting, but they are not impossible. The solutions are definitely there, at least the direction in which we have to move. We don't have all the answers. They've just been wrapped up in ways that have prevented us from understanding the threat and doing something about it. And now what we're doing is we're unwrapping that. But now that we know the threats and can look with clear eyes at the mistakes they and we have made, we also know we can do something about the challenge. It starts with helping the extraordinary people in this room face the problem without the haze of rose-tinted glasses. And through you, help the public and policymakers thoughtfully and righteously unwrap the pieces of the puzzle. Do that without letting today's solutions become tomorrow's problems. Thank you.